It's an absolute pleasure to be here, and I'd like to thank Maliha and the Islamic Finance and Ethics Society for inviting me. And it's a pleasure and an honor to be part of this wonderful panel. I've been scribbling whilst I've been listening, and I'm going to race through just a few conversation points, really reflecting on the work that I've been doing in the area of Muslim fashion and also modest fashion among the Abrahamic faiths and others over the last 10 or 12 years. Because as we've been hearing, 10 or more years ago, i.e. within living memory, this was not a topic. It was news. It was a, really? Muslim fashion? Is that not a contradiction in terms? Jewish modest fashion? Is that not a contradiction in terms? And we now have an established market, which, as you were pointing out, is both a relatively recent market and a market that is maturing and diversifying and segmenting. So, absolutely, Muslims are now being constructed as a consumer segment. And as we were hearing, initial interest has been in finance and in food. And I kept saying, oh, well, fashion will be the third F for Muslim marketers and Islamic branding. And indeed, that has been the case. But what I don't think we're going to see, and we might talk about this, are, for example, certification schemes for Muslim fashion. So one of the big deals in the halal food market has been different certification schemes, and indeed we know there are competing certification schemes. One of the things about fashion is, first of all, it is constantly changing, and secondly, as we can see in this room, as we can see when we look around the world, there are so many different interpretations in the way that women respond to the holy verses and to social and family and community convention and expectation, that we're looking at a situation in which there are many different styles and ways of covering. And one of the things that I've always been struck by when we look at the way that Muslim fashion has developed, it's developed both as commerce and as commentary. And the internet has been essential here because, of course, many startups were able to start up online without having to hold such inventory, invest such money in stock, without having to pay for stores and so on. But the other thing that the internet did was foster commerce and commentary. So blogs and all forms of social media. And many Muslim fashion commercial sites are also characterized by a high degree of social and political engagement. And in that way, I think they're forerunners of some of the more mainstream fashion interaction now with topics to do with sustainability and the social agenda. Now, this commerce has in many ways, alongside commentary, developed a community. And this is a community that, for me, is often characterized in its best instances by a respect for different people's approaches and for choices. And sometimes this is very difficult. So you can see some very difficult conversations happening where women are, and it's often women involved in this area, are struggling to deal with people who have different interpretations and different practices and to treat that with respect. The changes in the technology, so the advent of smartphones and tablets that are more affordable, means that more people are joining in. It also means that more people who are the self-appointed guardians of Muslim women's morality join in and tell Muslim women what they should and shouldn't be doing. So if you think back when probably there would be one computer in the living room or the kitchen, and if you were sitting there as a 16-year-old reading something or typing something, everybody else is going to be walking past and seeing what you're doing. Now kids can do it on the bus in secret. So can grown-ups. And that means that the volume and sometimes the ferocity of negative criticism increases, but so do the opportunities for people to take part in a supportive dialogue. Being constructed as a consumer segment is not an unalloyed good. What does it mean to have religious dispositions, to have parts of religious life, spiritual and personal expression and meaning commodified on the market? So I don't want to be the poster girl for neoliberal consumer capitalism, but I also know what it feels like, if you're part of a minority, to not find your life, your experiences, your community reflected in the predominant cultural forms of the world that you live in. And consumer culture is one of those predominant cultural forms. So I work at Oxford Circus. If I want to buy a Ramadan card, there is nowhere they're selling them. If I want to buy a bar mitzvah card or a bat mitzvah card, there is nowhere they're selling them. I can get them online, or I can get them in areas of community or ethnic or religious clustering. So on one hand, there is an advantage to being recognized, and on the other hand, there are a number of potential disadvantages. What does it mean when venues or events that used to be run by communities are now run by commerce? And we might think about some parallels with the gay community, who have also now become recognized as a consumer segment. So what does it mean if you're a young queer who hasn't got much money, and actually Pride, which used to take place in parks and cost nothing, or you could make a voluntary donation, is now in Soho and you can't afford the price of the entry to the commercial venues that you want to go to? Sure, there's stuff in the street that's free, but you feel excluded. So we also need to think about those things and to think, what does it mean when Dolce & Gabbana or other mainstream brands enter into what is now an established market? So the modest fashion market, by and large, was started by women and creative entrepreneurs and designers from within particular religious communities who couldn't find what they wanted. And they wanted to make and sell what they and their daughters wanted. One of the things that I looked at for my previous research project that resulted in the book Modest Fashion was whether, if you're a Muslim designer or a Jewish designer, do you find you get consumers from other faith groups? Do you welcome it? And do you adapt your designs to accommodate that? And sure enough, it was yes, yes, and yes. Well, when the big brands come in, does that represent a threat to your market share? Dolce & Gabbana seemed to be unaware that they were aiming at the Gulf, where there is already a thriving designer, a buyer market? Or does it just mean that it's a win-win because more people are aware that this market exists and that there's room to accommodate those things? I think that one of the points that I take away from today's conversation and from Nafisa's point about people don't just want halal slaughtered meat, they want ethically produced and well cared for meat, or perhaps they might want halal, they might want vegan products because the millennials are now melding those things together, this is also a sign of a maturing market and a maturing consumer base. And one of the other things we then may see in that maturing market and thinking about commerce and commentary together is also that the understanding about what counts with an engagement with modest fashion isn't necessarily or only Muslim women who cover their heads, isn't necessarily or only Orthodox Jewish women who cover their hair when they're married, but is a whole range of practices and styles. And so the ability to think more broadly about what does it mean to provide the means by which women want to present themselves in the world and in different circumstances, and what does it mean to widen the frame for how you accommodate those needs, can be very important. And I just want to say something about ethics and sustainability, because particularly in this country, fashion consumers are highly motivated, they think, they feel, about ethics and sustainability. It doesn't necessarily go all the way through, as you were saying. And also, for me, I feel it's quite important to say there isn't yet a position of total moral purity. You might be trying to source your fabrics ethically, but what about the thread or the buttons or the dye? It can't all necessarily be controlled. But also, I sometimes think, and I'll throw this out for conversation, that fashion gets a bum rap. Fashion is highly exploitative in many ways, but there is often more criticism of fashion consumption and of women as consumers of the unnecessary, vain and frivolous, because that's how consumption often produces and presents women. What about cars? Where does the fabric in your car come from? Where do the minerals and the chemicals that make up your iPhones and your gadgets come from, fueling war in Central Africa? So whilst I absolutely agree that we want fashion consumers to be ethical, I also would like us to widen that discussion and widen that ethical frame, because that's one of the other things that fashion commentary and commerce can do, which is widen the discussion and say, well, the learning that we have here can be applied also in other areas. And widening the discussion, I'm going to end with a shameless plug. In the events I run, Faith and Fashion, for London College of Fashion, either at the college or elsewhere, we have an event on Wednesday at Asia House. I think somewhere up there is a sign-in sheet. If you would like to find out about events, please write legibly with your name and your email. We will only email you about events and podcasts, and I would so welcome the opportunity to continue the conversation with you there as well as this evening. Thank you.